Services and Intelligence Committees, Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Senator, always good to see you. Let's talk about what's happening right now this week around the world, specifically in Brussels. I think a lot of Americans watch what happened in Paris in November, and before that at Charlie Hebdo, watch what happened in Brussels, and they wonder when it's coming here. San Bernardino, of course, took place a few months ago, but what do you do to stop something like what's happening in Europe right now from happening in this country?
Well, Willie, you're right that we've already been attacked by the Islamic State here in San Bernardino. There's been other attacks in places like Chattanooga and Garland as well. Fortunately, our military and our intelligence services are the world's leaders in counterterrorism policy, but we do have a lot of gaps when it comes to European capabilities. You know, the countries there are much smaller than ours. Their budgets are much smaller. Their capabilities are weaker. But ultimately, in my opinion, what happened in Brussels shows that you can't win the war on terror on defense. You have to win it on offense. You can't move the checkpoints at the airport from the gates to the check-in counter, from the check-in counter to the sidewalk. There's always going to be something outside the security perimeter. You have to go on offense against the Islamic State in places like Iraq and Syria and Libya and Afghanistan. And I think well, let me just say, Willie, that clip you just let in with, I think is very troubling. President Obama, in the middle of a terrorist attack, when Americans were murdered, maimed, and still missing, went to a baseball game and did the way with Castro, and he compared himself to Big Papi. Now, Big Papi is a great designated hitter. His job is to hit home runs. President Obama's job is to keep us safe. It's not to minimize the fear that Americans justly fear about terrorism. This is not a mistake on President Obama's part. This is the deliberate policy. They think that we have a disproportionate fear of terrorism in this country, even after Brussels and Paris and San Bernardino, and that they want to downplay that fear. President Obama goes around telling people that more Americans die in bathtub falls than are killed by terrorists.
So, Senator,
it's that mentality that we have to change and get on offense against the Islamic State if we don't want to see a Brussels-style attack here.
Senator, let's talk specifically about where you think the president is falling short. Do you think we ought to be putting more people on the ground in Syria and Iraq, or what's your strategy that would be different from what the president's doing now?
Well, we certainly already have several thousand on the ground there now. That's a question for our military commanders whether we need more. We absolutely need to loosen the rules of engagement. I frequently hear, not only from military personnel in our armed forces, but around the regional leaders as well, that their hands are tied, that we have sorties going out every single day that are coming back with bombs that are not being dropped because of restricted rules of engagement. We also need to look at what's happening in Europe. If countries can't get their own security situation under control, then we need to seriously consider whether we remove those countries temporarily from the visa waiver program so their citizens have to undergo a regular background check before they travel here. That's just a couple of the kinds of changes that I would look into.
Okay. Senator, it's Nicole Wallace. Yours is a serious and respected voice on matters of foreign policy in our party, and I wonder, two questions to you. One, if you're troubled by the fact that the two frontrunners in our party are having a Twitter feud about their wives, and I wonder if you think that Donald Trump, who's currently ahead and who I know you met with this week, can get to a place where if the question for voters in November is who is the better mind and the better policy on foreign policy, that Donald Trump is the clear answer. Can he get there based on your conversation with him?
Well, Nicole, I would just say that I think Melania and Heidi are both very successful, accomplished women. We should respect them for that. We should respect them as capable advocates for their husbands' campaigns and leave it at that. And then we should all get serious. Americans have been killed, they're maimed, they're missing. Americans want to know what their elected leaders are going to do to keep them safe. As far as the fall goes, it's still very early in our primary. There are more days ahead of us than there are behind us, so we don't know who our nominee will be. I know whoever that nominee is, though, will be more qualified to keep America safe than Hillary Clinton. She likes to portray herself as a safe, steady, experienced hand who's ready to answer the 3 a.m. phone call. She got one of those once. It was called Benghazi. She slept through it before Americans died.
Senator, Nicole mentioned a meeting with Donald Trump this week. Did you come out of that meeting more or less impressed with him than you'd been in the past?
Willie, the meeting occurred on Monday, and I didn't hear much different from what we've heard in public. You know, he had spoken earlier that day to the Washington Post editorial board and raised some serious questions about NATO. I share some of those questions. We used to split our costs 50-50 between the U.S. and Europe. Today it's 70-30 between the U.S. and Europe. Now, I would have a different approach. Rather than reducing our spending on what's a critical national security alliance, I would urge European leaders, as I have for 4 years, to increase their spending, specifically so we can stop the kind of terrorist attacks we've seen in Paris and Brussels. So we don't see in our eastern NATO partners, Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, the kinds of hybrid warfare that we have seen in Ukraine and Georgia. So he identified a serious problem that I've tried to address along with some of my colleagues. I would just have a slightly different solution for that problem.
So did you leave that room thinking that's a man who could be commander-in-chief?
Well, I think he could be the commander-in-chief. He's one of our leading candidates, and as I said, any of our candidates right now would be a better commander-in-chief. They'd be a more serious leader for our country than Hillary Clinton is, who has not only been the architect for Barack Obama's foreign policy, which has left the world aflame, but also shown such a casual disregard for the handling of sensitive national security secrets that I believe she's disqualified from being the commander-in-chief.
Senator Gene Robinson is in Washington with a question for you.
Senator, good to talk with you. You're so critical of President Obama and what he's doing, yet he seems to me to be doing against ISIS exactly what you would propose, which is attacking them in Iraq and Syria, degrading ISIS, taking away its territory. And I think you would agree that that's an essential component, perhaps the essential component of any fight against ISIS. So I guess I'm still confused as to exactly what your complaint is.
Well, I wouldn't go to the baseball game and do the wave with Castro or compare myself to Big Papi, whose job it is to beat the Yankees, not to keep America safe. Nor, Gene, going back to 2011, would I have squandered all the gains that we made in Iraq by defeating al-Qaeda in Iraq, the precursor of the Islamic State. That is the original source of the Islamic State's rise, that President Obama took all of our troops out of Iraq at a time when that country was relatively safe and gave them the space they needed, and then worked with Iran and gave them the ideological reason to justify their campaign of terror through the region. Those two things combined helped lead to the Islamic State. Now they're metastasizing around the world. President Obama led a very failed strategy in Libya, and now the Islamic State is on the verge of taking over that state. It's just a short boat ride away from our European allies. So there's lots of failed policies that he's undertaken that would have made the country much safer had he gone in a different direction.
Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, thanks for being with us this morning. We appreciate it as always.
Thank you all. Happy Good Friday.